the skeptic of the group, with her sharp wit and a habit of rolling her eyes at anything remotely supernatural. Emma was the quiet one, always clutching a book in her hands and speaking only when she had something important to say. Then there was Jenna, the self-proclaimed expert on all things paranormal, her enthusiasm for ghost stories often bordering on unsettling. Lastly, Liam, the only boy in the group, brought an air of casual bravado, though his occasional nervous glances betrayed his attempts at acting fearless. The night began like any other sleepover, pizza boxes stacked high on the kitchen counter, soda cans scattered across the table, and the steady hum of laughter filling the air. But as the hours stretched on and the clock struck midnight, the mood began to shift. The conversations turned quieter. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, and the sounds from the surrounding woods became more pronounced. It was Jenna who suggested telling ghost stories. She claimed to know 5 tales of real horror, each more terrifying than the last. At first, the others laughed, accusing her of trying to scare them for her own amusement. But her insistence, coupled with the eerie stillness that seemed to settle over the house, made them reluctantly agree. They gathered in a circle on the living room floor, the flickering light from a few candles casting long dancing shadows on the walls. Jenna began with a story about a girl who'd vanished after playing hide-and-seek in her family's basement. Her voice was low and deliberate, each word dripping with foreboding as she described the damp, claustrophobic space where the girl was last seen. She claimed the story was true, that it had happened to a distant cousin of hers. As she spoke, the others listened intently, their faces illuminated by the warm, unsteady glow of the candles. Even Kayla, who usually dismissed such tales with a scoff, seemed unusually quiet. The second story was about an abandoned house at the edge of town, where strange noises were said to echo through the halls at night. Jenna swore she'd been inside once, that she'd heard the whispers herself. As she recounted the experience, a faint creaking noise echoed through the living room. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the sound. Liam laughed nervously, suggesting it was just the house settling, but his voice wavered slightly. By the time Jenna started the third story, a palpable tension had settled over the group. This one was about a figure that appeared in mirrors, its face obscured, but its presence undeniable. Jenna described how the figure would linger, watching until the viewer turned away. Then it would be gone, leaving behind only the faintest trace of its reflection. As she spoke, Emma clutched her knees to her chest, her wide eyes fixed on the mirror hanging above the fireplace. The others followed her gaze, their breaths catching in their throats as they stared at their own distorted reflections. A loud knock at the front door shattered the silence. The group jumped, their heads snapping toward the sound. It was loud and deliberate, a heavy thud that echoed through the house. Amanda, who had remained relatively calm until now, hesitated before standing. "Probably just the wind," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Amanda moved toward the door, the others close behind her. She peeked through the peephole, but saw nothing but darkness. "No one's there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma suggested they check the security cameras, a precaution Amanda's parents had installed after a string of break-ins in the area. The group huddled around Amanda's phone as she pulled up the live feed. The camera facing the front porch showed nothing unusual, just the empty steps and the swaying shadows of the trees. But as they switched to the backyard view, a collective gasp escaped them. A figure stood just beyond the edge of the porch light, barely visible in the shadows. It was motionless, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The grainy image made it impossible to discern any details, but the figure's presence was undeniable. Jenna across their faces, and the room felt colder with every word. When Jenna paused to catch her breath, a faint tapping echoed from the far wall. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and unmistakable. The group froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the sound. "It's just the house," Kayla said, her voice cracking. "Old houses make noises." But the tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. It moved too, starting from one corner of the room and traveling along the walls, as though something unseen were circling them. Liam stood abruptly, his fists clenched. "We need to check it out," he said, though the fear in his voice was palpable. "No," Amanda whispered, her face pale. "We stay here, together." The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so thick it seemed to press against their ears. For a moment, they thought it was over. But then a new sound emerged, a soft, shuffling noise, like bare feet dragging across the floor. It came from the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. The group huddled closer together, their eyes fixed on the doorway. A shadow appeared first, long and distorted, stretching unnaturally as it moved. Then slowly, a figure emerged. It was a woman, or at least what remained of one. Her skin was pale and translucent, stretched tightly over bones that jutted at odd angles. Her hair hung in matted clumps, and her hollow eyes stared straight ahead, unseeing yet full of malice. The figure moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, her head twitching to one side as though her neck couldn't support its weight. She stopped just inside the doorway, her gaze sweeping the room. No one dared to breathe. The figure raised a hand, her long, bony fingers pointing directly at Jenna. Jenna let out a strangled gasp, scrambling backward. "It's her," she whispered, her voice shaking. "The woman from the story." The figure took a step forward, her movements slow and deliberate. The air grew colder with each step, frost forming on the windows and the edges of the blankets. Emma began to sob quietly, burying her face in her hands. Liam stood frozen, his face ashen. Amanda grabbed Jenna's arm, pulling her back toward the group. "What does she want?" she hissed, her voice barely audible. Jenna shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know." The figure stopped at the edge of the circle, her head tilting again as though studying them. She raised her other hand, and the lights flickered violently before plunging the room into complete darkness. The group screamed, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear. In the pitch black, the sounds began again, the tapping, the shuffling, and now something new. A low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It spoke words they couldn't understand, a language that felt wrong to hear, as though it wasn't meant for human ears. Someone fumbled for a flashlight, and a weak beam of light pierced the darkness. The figure was gone, but the whispers remained, growing louder and more frantic. The group huddled together, their fear palpable. Then, from the far corner of the room, a voice called out, soft, melodic, and chillingly familiar. It was Amanda's voice. "Come here," it said. "I need your help." Amanda froze, her eyes wide with terror. "That's not me," she whispered. The voice called again, more insistent this time. "Come here," it repeated, the tone almost pleading. The group stared at the corner, the flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated nothing but empty space. The whispers grew louder, drowning out everything else. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, forming shapes that defied logic. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The group sat in stunned silence, the weight of what they'd experienced pressing down on them. No one spoke, too afraid to break the fragile stillness. Somewhere deep within the house, creaked open. Amanda locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one as the others followed closely behind. They tried to laugh it off, to convince themselves it was just a prank or their imaginations playing tricks on them. But the uneasy feeling lingered, a heavy weight pressing down on them. As the clock struck 3, Jenna began her 4th story. This one was different, quieter, more personal. She claimed it had happened to her when she was a child, that she'd woken one night to find a figure standing at the foot of her bed. It hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but its presence had filled the room with a suffocating dread. She described its long, bony fingers, and the way its head seemed to twitch as though it were struggling to hold itself upright. As Jenna spoke, the lights flickered. The group froze, their breaths shallow. The candles on the floor sputtered, but didn't go out. "It's just the power," Liam said, though his voice was barely audible. Amanda checked her phone, but the Wi-Fi was down, the live feed from the cameras gone. Kayla suggested they all sleep in the living room, where they could keep an eye on each other. They dragged blankets and pillows from Amanda's room, setting up a makeshift sleeping area in the center of the room. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind, felt magnified, like the house itself was alive and watching. As the first light of dawn began to seep through the windows, the group lay in uneasy silence. No one spoke of what they'd seen or felt that night, as though saying it out loud would give it power. But each of them knew, deep down, that something had shifted, that the house had changed in some fundamental way. And as the day wore on, the memory of the figure in the shadows lingered, a haunting reminder that some stories aren't just stories, they're warnings. The morning after the unsettling events, the group barely spoke as they packed up their sleeping bags and tidied the living room. The air was heavy with unspoken tension, each of them too afraid to acknowledge the strange occurrences from the night before. Amanda tried to lighten the mood by suggesting pancakes for breakfast, but her voice was thin, forced. No one responded, and the suggestion fell into the uneasy silence that hung over them like a storm cloud. Kayla, ever the skeptic, finally broke the quiet. "It was probably just some weird shadow," she said, her tone sharp but lacking conviction. "And the cameras, probably a glitch or something." She avoided meeting anyone's eyes, her hands trembling slightly as she folded her blanket. No one argued, but the silence that followed was louder than any words of dissent. The day passed slowly, and the group busied themselves with mundane distractions, board games, movies, anything to drown out the lingering unease. But no matter how hard they tried, the house seemed to hum with an invisible energy. Shadows in the corners stretched longer than they should, and the faint creaks of the floorboards echoed even when no one was moving. The once cozy house felt foreign, as though it had been watching them and was now waiting for something. As night fell, Amanda hesitated before suggesting they sleep in the living room again. The others agreed without protest, unwilling to spend another night alone in their respective rooms. They gathered blankets and pillows, setting up a communal sleeping area just as they had the night before. Jenna, who had been unusually quiet all day, broke her silence as they settled in. "I never finished the last story," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The others turned to her, their expressions a mix of dread and curiosity. "I know you don't believe me," she continued, her eyes darting nervously around the room, "but I think it's important. This last one, it's not like the others." Emma shifted uncomfortably, clutching her knees to her chest. "Do we have to hear it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should just try to sleep." Jenna shook her head. "It's connected," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "To this house, to what's been happening. I didn't realize it until last night, But now I'm sure. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but didn't interrupt. Jenna took a deep breath and began her story. She spoke of a house, old and forgotten, where the air always seemed colder than it should be. She described how people who stayed there would hear voices calling their names, feel unseen hands brushing against them in the dark. She told them about the previous occupants, all of whom had vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind nothing but whispers of their presence.